Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. This is the podcast where we help you challenge your mindset and discover where you are. Tired of stories about other people's success? We can help you change your life, determine your time freedom point, and join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hey everybody, how are you doing? I'm back with you for another episode of the Ideal Investor Show, and today I wanted to bring you something for maybe contemplation or consideration, and honestly I'm kind of interested to find out what you would think about it. So what am I talking about? I saw something that is being officially proposed. Now, I know we're coming up on the election and, everything is lame duck and nobody's going to make decisions. But I think fundamentally this is something to consider. And the person I will introduce you to who is actually proposing this approach is doing it for reasons that are different than what we basically would be interested in. But I still think it's important. And so the guy's name is John Hope. And he is the CEO, and I think he's also the founder of a non-profit organization that is mainly interested in financial literacy. And that is actually what attracted me to it, because as you know, I've been raving and ranting about the fact that why are our kids, I didn't, I guess my daughter didn't, and I'm pretty sure I haven't heard anywhere that it has changed since, that kids in school, even in high school, how important it is to understand how credit cards work and how loans work and how car loans work and how a bank account works and who owns the money and those fundamental things. And so what is John Hope actually suggesting? And suggesting in the sense of like an application to the government, and that is to allow, with government support and with some like insurance, so to speak, insurance not in the traditional sense, but more like a guarantee by the government, to not only like currently have mortgages that have a term of maximum of 30 years, but to have up to 40-year mortgages. And what he is basically saying is, if you look at why did somebody come up with a 30-year term maximum for mortgage? And the explanation used to be, and I don't know if you guys listening regularly to the show were aware of this, but the explanation was like this. If you looked at the numbers at the time when this 30-year government-supported maximum mortgage term came out, people were getting into, for the first time in their life, into their own home or their own condo or anything like that needed a mortgage for a first-time home buyer in their 30s. So the earliest that was to be found was like at 30 and then into the 30s and so forth. The other thing that is obviously been known is that if people get into their first-time home as first-time home buyers in their 30s and they retire in their 60s, then it would make sense that in that time in between they should be able to pay off the house. Now you have to keep in mind, when all this was put together, it was more common that people worked for one employer in their lifetime, that they basically had a regular income in their lifetime, that it was normal that one person, this is where the term head of household comes from, was the main breadwinner or the main income generator, and that person's income would be sufficient to, for 30 years, pay a mortgage so that the house that they actually bought in their 30s will be paid off in their 60s. Now, when you're listening, you might say, well, that's not really the reality and hasn't been the reality for a long time. And it's true if you look at how long are people in a house that they bought as their primary residence. I think the average right now is 7 or 8 years. And it's getting a little longer, but it's nowhere near the 30 years. But the calculation was still valid to say, okay, if people buy the first-time home in their 30s, they pay it for 30 years, so then they're in their 60s, and sometime in their 60s they're going to retire, which means by then they don't have that burden of the mortgage payment anymore, and they own the house free and clear. And it doesn't really matter whether it's the first house or another house over time that they have been buying. Now, one thing that's a little flawed about it is you could theoretically live in a house for 20 years, then sell it and buy something way more nice, bigger, and so forth take the equity out of the first house, get a new 30-year mortgage, and now you're in your 50s and you have to pay until you're 80. But that wasn't the foundation of where the 30-year term came from. So what John Hope and his nonprofit is arguing is to say these rules were put in place when the life expectancy of people was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. So it also made sense from a risk management perspective to say, okay, if people get, let's say, high 60s, like 68, 69 on average, then we also want to make sure that the risk is mitigated and the mortgages are paid by then. Now the life expectancy is like around 80. And I think in the United States it's 78 and women is 80 or 81. So it's kind of around 80, which would mean that you could, if you get a mortgage in your 30s or 40s and pay it off in 40 years, still achieve the same thing, that by the time you are no longer around, the mortgage has also been paid. There are some implications what would happen if somebody is retiring, let's say in their mid to late 60s, and then still has to pay for 10 years the mortgage payment, but we're going to address that in a moment. So what do I think about? And like I said in the beginning, I really would be very, very interested to find out what you guys think about this idea of extending the maximum term from 30 years to 40 years and have an option for government support and insurance. Now, John Hope also says he wants to use this for first-time home buyers as the original 30 years was used and combine it with anybody who applies for a 40-year mortgage as a first-time home buyer. Not only would they get maybe a little bit better interest rate with government support, but they would also have to finish a course, a training program for financial literacy and education. I think that combination is an excellent idea for first-time home buyers. Now, the other reason why I think for us it would be a great idea if this were available for us as investors is a little bit different. I'm also a big fan of financial literacy, and in our mentoring program, I'm always pushing to teach and educate everybody who is in our program as much as I can with what I have learned, and I've probably only learned like 30 or 40% of what's out there to be learned. But the other part that is kind of interesting if you ask yourself, why would a 40-year mortgage actually make sense? And that is assuming that you were to really buy a property and keep that mortgage all your 40 years life, is if you look at how much or how hard would it be if you get it in your 30s, which would mean you would have to pay it until you're in your 70s. And people might be worried to say, okay, well, how do I afford it if I'm retired, if I retire at 65 or 67, and I still have to pay another 10 years? Well, the answer to that is you have to look at the value, the purchasing power of money. And the purchasing power of $1 that you pay into that 40-year mortgage now versus the last 10 years between year 30 and year 40, I wouldn't be surprised if the purchasing power of that dollar is down to like 20 cents, maybe even worse. So that means somebody who today would have to pay in today's dollars, let's say a $2,000 mortgage, just in principal and interest, in 40 years, and you pay those $2,000 mortgage, let's say, out of a $4,500 income. In 40 years, your income is probably something like 45, about 15, 16,000, just to maintain the purchasing power that $4,500 is now, and your payment would still be $2,000. Your retirement pay, which for most people is somewhere between 60 and 75% of what their last pay was, is probably like $13,000, $14,000, and you have to pay $2,000 a month to the last few years of that, last 10 years of that 40-year mortgage. Now, there's a little bit of a theoretical view on it, and one thing that is probably true and would have to be considered is who can actually get a 40-year mortgage. Like, I'm over 60. If I were to get a 40-year mortgage today, then that would mean I have any kind of chance to get more than 100 years old. I don't think any bank or any lender would want to take that risk, right? But for people that are in their 30s or 40s and they can get a 40-year mortgage, I would absolutely say get that, because one of the things that will happen is that your monthly payment, if it stretches for 40 years instead of 30 years, will be lower. And that means you will have better cash flow. And if you don't need to consume that cash flow, you can put it back into the mortgage and ultimately pay it off early. Which brings it back to reality. Are people ever really keeping their mortgages for 30 years for the today? Or then if this were possible for 40 years, probably not. But the big benefit, and that brings us back to John Hope and his nonprofit, and that's what he's actually pointing out, is that for people nowadays, it's harder and harder and harder to ever get into home ownership. And having a 40-year term for the mortgage means you don't have to have as high an income to qualify for a 40-year mortgage because your monthly payment would be significantly less. So I like it. I like the idea. I like it mainly because of the purchasing power of money, but I also like it for first-time home buyers who are really currently struggling because houses are relatively expensive, interest rates are relatively high, and therefore the monthly payment is oftentimes too high to qualify. And with a 40-year mortgage, more people would qualify. So that's it for today. I think this is an interesting thing, and if you don't want to put the answer to my question, what you think about it, in the comments. And by the way, it would be awesome if you would download this episode and give the show a review. But if you don't want to do that, then please go to idealinvestorshow.com and find the button to book a call and tell me myself to my face, what do you think about a 40-year mortgage? That would also be awesome. And if you really, really, really want to be super nice, then do all of those things. So that's it for today. Be well and stay safe, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.